And it oftentimes, sorry about that, it will oftentimes begin with an overture, which is just the instrumental introduction before the action begins. And a lot of times the overture will kind of give you a preview of some of the musical themes that you'll hear throughout the work itself here. So that's just kind of a snapshot definition of what I would tell my music appreciation students of basically what opera is. So just a few more kind of terms to dig into before we start to talk about the development of opera. There's a distinction in the solo style of singing that we have. We have recitatives and arias. And so both of these would be done for solo voice. Differences occur in the overall musical makeup of these styles, as well as accompaniment or orchestral involvement. So the recit or recitative, that's used more to kind of get the story moving, to provide narration. And so the musical characteristic of this, recitatives are not typically fully sung. So you're not going to get this beautiful lyrical line. It's rather speech-like. The rhythm of these recits is going to match the rhythm of the text. So very speech-like in nature. And it's going to have minimal involvement from the orchestra. In its early time, it would probably only use the basso continuo, which would be a keyboard instrument with some type of low-pitched instrument, just basically to keep the right key or to kind of punctuate the line just a little bit. But it's not got a lot of involvement from the orchestra. And then the aria, on the other hand of that, is going to be much more expressive, more fully sung. This is where the singer really gets a chance to show off their capability, and the composer gets a chance to show off their lyrical writing. So these arias are not necessarily intended to move the story along. Rather, it's an opportunity to kind of sit with the emotion of the story in that moment. And the orchestra is fully involved in these arias as it has developed there. So again, those are just some basic differences that we see between these two solo styles, and we'll refer to them, and I've got some examples to show you here as we move along as well. One other thing on the aria, a lot of times, at least in the Baroque period opera, these arias would be done in a da capo style, which is just a simple A-B-A structure. So you have your A section, your opening section, and then a contrasting section, and then that opening section returns with the addition of ornamentation or embellishment. Again, another chance to make it even more emotional or expressive there. And so the emergence of early opera is really connected to what's going on in the Renaissance era, specifically with theater. A number of scholars have argued that the emergence of opera was in contrast to the musical style of vocal polyphony that we would have seen in the Renaissance era. If you think of Josquin des Prez, these multiple vocal lines all happening at once, very complex music. Opera really focuses on a single line. It focuses on individual voice, individual text, in something known as the stile representativo. And so kind of the most important thing of this type of musical style would be the text and expressing that appropriately. So again, the most important aspect of this would be text. Then the next kind of emphasis of the stile representativo would be rhythm, and then finally the overall sound. That's kind of the hierarchy that we would see with that. So again, the text is the most important, and it requires that the singers, as well as the players in the orchestra, any of the musicians involved, have a really solid awareness of the dramatic context of the story, and specifically the dramatic context of the words being sung, and really kind of tapping into being able to musically express that text in a moving way. And so all of this is kind of focusing on this early stile representativo style. And so we see opera really kind of take off following meetings of the Florentine Camerata in 1570s. And so here we would have a group of musicians, poets, noblemen, intellectuals that were all kind of meeting together here, basically in an attempt to revive Greek drama, Greek tragedy there. And so they kind of met together to see how can we get music back to representing the text. Now that's something different than what we would consider text painting, which has been in existence for quite some time. A number of madrigals in the Renaissance era would musically represent the meaning of the text being sung at the same time. So maybe if the line is from a psalm, we exalt the Lord on high, maybe the melody would go up, right? So musically representing the literal meaning of the text. This is intended to represent the emotion behind the text rather than kind of a literal definition there as well. And so this idea to get back to the text, to elevate the quality or the expression through music of the text itself was something that the Camerata really focused on. And these would have been influenced by what was known as intermezzi performances. These would have been musical or entertainment performances between the acts of plays during this time period. So it's already connected to the stage, just not necessarily in its kind of final operatic form there as well. So from this Camerata, we see a few composers that were important here. Vincenzo Galilei, the father of the famous astronomer there, was a music theorist in both the Latin and Greek traditions. And he worked to develop and really kind of put forward the stile representativo, right, or this emphasis of the text there. He wrote music for the Camerata, so he was directly involved with this group as well. And then Caccini there, also, you can see his dates just slightly later than Galilei, collaborated with Galilei in the Camerata, so again, both of them fairly connected to this group. His songs helped to establish and spread the monodic vocal style or music style that was born out of representativo. So again, the monodic style very closely related to that. It's a single melody, very minimal accompaniment, but its emphasis is on the text. That's the most important aspect of that style of music there as well. So it would have had a single solo vocal line, sometimes with embellishments, but a very simple accompaniment to support that. And this would allow the composers to really put their energy into highlighting the text and highlighting the dramatic impact of the text that they were setting there as well. And so that brings us to kind of the first operas that we see. So mythological subject matter is probably the most prominent text that we would see these early operas employ. Peri, as well as Caccini, both set the story of, Peri set the story of Daphne, which is now lost. But the earliest surviving opera that we have would have been a setting of Eurydice or Eurydice from that Greek mythology tradition there. Peri, as well as Caccini, both set texts or both set music to this story and to this text. They kind of did it as rivals in a sense, but that's really kind of the earliest example of opera that is known. And this story of Orpheus and Eurydice is a very common one that we see a number of composers setting that. And that gives us kind of our first example today that we're going to dig into, Claudio Monteverdi, Italian composer. He's known largely for his madrigals. So he's kind of in between the Renaissance era and the Baroque era, one foot in each camp there. But he begins his opera journey with a setting of Orfeo. It's the same story. If you're familiar with the story there, we have Orpheus, who was an incredible musician, played the lyre, and was in love with Eurydice. She is bitten by a snake and dies and is taken to the underworld. And Orpheus goes after her and pleads to bring her back, and is granted permission to do this on the condition that he does not look back to see if Eurydice is following him until he gets back to Earth. But in this kind of tragic story, he almost makes it. He looks back, and then she's lost forever. So that's kind of the overall story that we get there. And so his setting of Orpheus in 1607 really is probably the prime example of early opera. It's going to use that stile representativo or monodic vocal style even in its aria form. So you're not going to hear a ton of really highly developed or impactful orchestration. It's going to be centered on the text. And so what I would like to do is to listen to an example of this. It's the aria to Se Morta, which is Orpheus finding out that Eurydice has died. So bear with me here. We might have to endure an ad, but maybe not. There we go. All right. It may take just a second for the computer mic to re-regulate my volume here. Here we go. All right, so what we heard, again, emphasized the text. It was fully sung, but still speech-like in nature, trying to convey the emotion behind the text in both the solo presentation done by Orpheus as well as the ensemble singing, as they were all kind of singing together there as well. So moving from Florence and Mantua, where Monteverdi had written Orfeo, we see the journey of opera move kind of geographically. So in Rome, Rome would have been kind of the hub of opera in the 1620s and 30s. There was a private opera theater that was built there, likely by the Barberinis, that set over 3,000 people. Again, these would not have been seats you could purchase a ticket for. These would have been private performances there for the upper class. All of this kind of falling in line with the tradition of opera seria, and we'll kind of break that down just a little bit. But this particular type of opera was certainly geared toward the upper class in just its availability, as well as in the subject matter that it would address. So Roman opera would have been a bit more lavish, placing more importance on dances as well as ensemble. So we would have seen duets and trios and things like that. The recitatives continue in their speech-like tradition, but begin to provide greater contrast to aria. So we're seeing more speech-like emphasis on the recit and a more fully sung, more lyrical presentation in the arias there. So the plots of these, again, would have been serious. Sometimes we would have had some comic elements thrown in there, but by and large, these are going to be settings of mythological stories. And so we see Landini and Rossi both being important composers in Roman opera. And then we start to see Venice have kind of a surge in opera performance and popularity. So this is where we start to see the first public opera house in 1637, so in Venice there. So while in Venice, Monteverdi wrote 4 operas, 2 of which were lost, but his Coronation of Poppée, the first to use an actual historical subject matter rather than kind of camping out with the mythological story. So this is set in Rome, 64 AD, as Poppée persuades Nero to marry her, resulting in her being crowned empress there. And so the image that's on this slide is kind of an imagined recreation of what this public opera house would have looked like, the Teatro San Cassiano. You can see it's very ornate, it's beautiful. And so I think it's interesting to kind of see what this would have looked like so long ago. So after Monteverdi, Venice continues to be an important location for opera. We see a number of composers traveling to Venice and working directly there simply for the opera scene that we have there. Again, with Cesi and Cavalli and Legrenzi, these composers would provide plots that were a little bit unrealistic, but would still have some serious as well as comic scenes thrown in there. We see a very elaborate scenery. Stage machinery is used. Very common. Sometimes we would see gods coming in on a cloud, just as part of the impact and dramatic emphasis that we see. But we do see solo singing dominate this particular type of opera in this time period there. Ensembles were not terribly important. Moving on, opera takes a back seat to the solo voice there as well. It's only used to accompany rather than to kind of put these musicians and instrumentalists on kind of the forte there. We do see that change as music develops, especially once we get into the classical period. Opera really makes full use of the orchestra as both accompaniment and part of the storytelling process in its own right. So following Venice, so we have Naples, so about 1650, or opera following 1650, Naples becomes an important location of development. Neapolitan opera would feature a very strong distinction between recitative and aria. So the recits, again, staying very speech-like in nature, minimal accompaniment, contrasting the aria, which would be more fully sung. So the recits, again, would oftentimes have sudden changes in mood or tempo. It would be, again, just intended to mimic the flow of the speech and the text that would be involved there. The arias would have been more fully sung, and again, intended to be more of an expressive device rather than a narration. And the arias would use full orchestral accompaniment to do that. And so that's kind of a snapshot of what we see happening in Italy with early opera. And so we start to see opera go beyond this country. In the German-speaking courts, Italian opera shows up because composers are traveling. So Antonio Cesti was active in Vienna, and then in Innsbruck from 1623 to 1669 there. Heinrich Schütz composed the first opera in the German language in 1627. Again, it was a setting of Daphne, which we mentioned was the first opera that was in existence, now lost. Schütz Opera of Daphne is also lost there. But the first German public opera house that we see occurs in Hamburg in 1678 with Reinhard Kreiser as a very influential operatic composer there in Hamburg. And so a very well-known composer, George Friedrich Handel, was born in Halle, Germany. He's one of my favorite composers simply because he's kind of all over the place and extremely successful in the different endeavors that he attempts. And so he travels to Hamburg early in his career, is exposed to Italian opera, and writes his first opera there. And he develops such an interest in this. He actually goes to Italy for a while to study Italian opera. He was employed by the Elector of Hanover, ended up in London as the leading composer of Italian opera, even though he was German born. While in London, becomes the father of the English oratorio. So opera and oratorio are very similar in the performing forces that are involved. They both will use solo singing, ensemble singing, orchestral accompaniment. The biggest difference is where opera would use costumes, scenery, spoken dialogue, that type of thing. Oratorio would not. It would just be the musical presentation there, and it wouldn't be acted out. And the subject matter really is what distinguishes these genres. Opera can have basically any subject matter, from mythology to historical figures to anything else, really. And the oratorio is limited to a sacred text. And so this really develops because during the season of Lent, the 40 days leading up to Easter, the church had decided that these opera performances were inappropriate in this time, that we should be reflective on Christ's sacrifice and looking toward Good Friday and then Resurrection Sunday on Easter. And so Handel, being an opera composer, still needed to earn money. And so these oratorios were a way to continue to have performances and income with keeping it more in line with a sacred idea. So I'm sure you all are familiar with some of Handel's oratorios. Messiah is by and large his most well-known oratorio. So it's really interesting, I think, to see that opera and oratorio were developing pretty much in step with each other. They're two sides of the same kind of staged performance as well. So Handel, again, being German born, traveling to Italy, traveling to London, and becoming one of the leading composers of Italian opera. And so one of them that I do want to mention is his Giulio Cesare. Is probably one of his more well-known operas, which basically details the love story between Julius Caesar and Cleopatra. And we'll listen to an example of that here in just a moment once we get a little bit later. But we don't see a particularly German style of opera develop until the early 1800s, around 1810. With Carl Maria von Weber's Der Freischütz, really kind of bringing that German musical history to the operatic stage. So while we were having operas done in the German language, they were musically rooted in the Italian opera tradition. And then in France, we have kind of a late start there. We don't see the first French opera written until about 1671 or 1674, somewhere in that window. So that's significantly later than the emergence of opera in Italy. And the reason for that was because Louis XIV controlled the arts in France during this time period. And it wasn't until Jean-Baptiste Lully had kind of gained the favor of Louis XIV that we start to see these operas come about. But there's a catch to it. These opera composers, specifically Lully, were writing to cater to the specific preferences of the king. And so the king enjoyed ballet. So dance became a huge part of French opera. We start to see really the king be the only person that these composers are writing for. So the audience is literally limited to one. It didn't matter what the other audience members thought, they were writing for the preference of the king. The plots were often tragedies based on mythology. And the quality of the libretto or the text or the story was very important, more so even than in the Italian tradition. These operas would have had a prologue that would have been specifically in praise of the king. And they would have incorporated ballet, ensemble, or choral singing much more so than the Italian tradition would have done. And again, this is because it's what the king had enjoyed and liked. And here we start to see the orchestra taking on a more prominent or important role rather than only accompanying the singing. So again, this was due specifically to the king's preference and composers trying to cater to that. And so of this, we see the French overture form emerge, which is characterized by a slow introduction or a slow section that begins with dotted rhythms, and then a faster contrapuntal or polyphonic section in the middle, and then an option for another slow section at the end. And so these orchestral overtures become really important. And I want to take just a moment to listen to and to view one of the dance scenes and ensemble singing from Lully's opera Persée, which is the story of Perseus and Medusa. So bear with me one moment and we'll see if this will load. All right, we'll give this just a second to load. Again, hopefully the mic is readjusting those levels. But that gives us an idea of what the ensemble singing as well as the emphasis of ballet would have looked like in French opera. So I mentioned these overtures where the French overture employed a slow section to open with dotted rhythms. And we have the Italian tradition there as well, which typically starts with a faster section. And I think it's important to note the impact that these overtures had on the classical period, which is coming later. So eventually, operatic overtures, known as sinfonia, began to be performed separately from the operas themselves. And so this is where we start to see the emergence of the classical period symphony. You can kind of hear phonetically symphonia, symphony, and that connection there. So we start to see these become standalone compositions. And through the work of Stamitz and then Haydn in the classical period, establishing them in 4 movements really sets up for the classical period symphony. So I think it's really interesting how these two very different genres are so connected at their root, and how it's impacted more than just this individual genre. So that brings us to opera in England, which, just like France, has a little bit of a later start. The first English opera wasn't until 1683 by John Blow. It was Venus and Adonis. Now, we had some small stage performances and things like that there, but not necessarily full opera until that time. But the reason that opera starts so late in England is for a very different reason than that of the story of France. So we have the Commonwealth period where Charles I was overthrown by the Puritans under Oliver Cromwell in 1649. And this resulted in the shutdown of all theaters. The Puritans believed that any and all theatrical performance would have been sinful. And so they were banned during this time period. But in 1660, following Cromwell's death, Charles II was instated as king. And then that brings us to the Restoration period, reviving dramatic performance. And so this is really when opera makes its way on the English stage there. One of the kind of iconic English composers, Henry Purcell, he was the foremost restoration composer. He was probably the most well-known during this time period. And his opera, Dido and Aeneas, really uses both French and Italian influences. And so basically we have the story, Dido, the Queen of Carthage, falls in love with Aeneas, who's the Trojan prince. And then while offering him safe harbor on his journey home, a sorceress who hates Dido plans to separate them. She creates a storm and sends one of her servants to urge Aeneas to return home straight away, forsaking Dido. And so we've got a couple of examples here to look at. I want to look at Dido's Lament. This is in two parts. It's the recitative, which again is speech-like, minimal involvement from the orchestra, which is Thy Hand, Belinda, and it goes into the aria, When I Am Laid in Earth. And so this is Dido's tragic end with her broken heart. And so I think this should move seamlessly into both. Let me see if it'll work here.
Mm, mm, mm.
We'll go ahead and stop there for this one. So just a few things that I want to mention about this particular aria. It's known as a ground bass aria. If you noticed when we moved from the recitative Thy Hand, Belinda, there was a brief moment of a descending bass line, and that was repeated throughout the aria there. And again, the aria much more emotional. I love this particular performance there, and just the vocal control at the end is just gorgeous, and I think really kind of brings the emotive nature of that scene to life there. So there's just another brief example that I want us to look at to just kind of show the difference and distinction between recitative and aria. Um, these are from Handel's Julius Caesar. So the first one, both of these are sung by Cleopatra. The first one is Che sento odio, that's the recitative, and then it's immediately followed by the aria, Se pietà di me non senti. Unfortunately, I didn't have them in the same um, audio link, so they're separated there. But in the performance, it would have been a seamless transition. So we'll listen to just a brief moment of each of these to hear the musical difference and distinction between these two styles.
Chi sento, oddio, urla Cleopatra ancora. Anima vile, che parli mal, taci, avrò per vendicarmi in bellicosa parte, di bellura in sembianza, un cor di Marte.
So before we play the second example here, the aria, did you notice how the orchestra was very conversational? She would sing a little bit, and then we would get response from the orchestra. Then she would sing again, and the orchestra would respond. So it wasn't truly fully accompanying her. It was more of a back and forth, very speech-like in nature. And then here's the aria that would immediately follow. Unfortunately, there's not a great place to stop in that, but I do want to draw your attention to the impact of the orchestra. Right before the singer even began, um, we get this long orchestral introduction, and it is fully involved throughout the entirety of the aria there. So hopefully that helps to just distinguish or differentiate between the recitative, kind of speech-like narrative with minimal involvement from the orchestra, and the fully sung, fully lyrical, fully emotional, fully accompanied aria, as is tradition there. So that kind of is a snapshot of what we have up until or up through the Baroque period. And these operas would have been considered opera seria, which is the term here on the slide there. So serious opera, often based on mythological stories or people of great historical significance. But again, the mythological subject matter is the most popular. And these would have been intended for the upper class. A lot of these would have been private performances. We do see that shift once we get to the classical period with the development of opera buffa. So opera buffa is comic opera, and there's some significant changes that occur here. Obviously, the subject matter is going to be different. We're going to have more of a lighthearted feel. This was geared more towards the middle class or just the general public for a number of reasons. These would have been open performances, so if you could afford the ticket, you could attend the performance. And a lot of times it made fun of nobility. The noble characters or the upper class characters of these operas were oftentimes made out to be foolish, and at the same time, the common person or the everyday man would have been elevated to the status of hero. So upper class didn't necessarily appreciate those elements of opera buffa as much as the middle class did. And so that's really one of the significant changes that we see as opera moves from the Baroque period on into the classical period. But opera seria doesn't necessarily go away. It does decline in popularity as opera buffa comes into play here. So it's still around, but opera buffa certainly is more popular during that time period. So I don't think we can think about classical period opera without thinking about Mozart. Certainly, he was not the only classical period opera composer. Christoph Gluck was certainly influential there, but we think of Mozart when we think of classical period opera. And you can see on the chart a list of his operas. So he had a few opera seria examples, his Idomeneo in 1781 that he wrote in Munich, and then the Clemency of Titus in 1791 in Prague, both of those being opera seria in his Italian column. And then you see he's got an opera buffa with the Marriage of Figaro, so again, comic opera, and he did that in Vienna. And then Don Giovanni is kind of a new category here. It's Dramma Giocoso, which was actually the subtitle of one of Handel's Baroque period operas, but is basically a combination of opera seria and opera buffa. So you have a serious subject or a serious story with a number of comic moments throughout that were not subtle. These would have been slapstick comedy moments kind of put into the story here. So his Don Giovanni fits into that Dramma Giocoso. Mozart is often credited with establishing the style. He's certainly the one that popularized it. So that's kind of another category of classical period opera that we have there. And then in his German column, again, these would have been German language, not necessarily a German style of opera. His Entführung aus dem Serail, or The Abduction of Seraglio, would have been a Singspiel, which was a light-hearted comic opera in a sense. And then probably his most well-known most famous opera would be Die Zauberflöte, or the Magic Flute, which again has those elements of opera buffa, but this one is rooted in Masonic symbolism. Mozart himself was a member of the Masons, as was his librettist. So it makes sense that some of these themes would have shown up in his work. So that's just kind of a snapshot of a few things that Mozart contributed to the classical period opera. I would like, if we've got time, I know we're approaching 3 o'clock, but if we've got time, I would love to look at 2 examples from the Magic Flute, and just kind of talk about this contribution. Would that be okay?
Sure. Sorry.
Thank you. All right, so hopefully, I'm sure many of you recognize the Queen of the Night aria that comes in Act 2 of the Magic Flute, where Tamina has been rescued from her captivity by Zarastro, and her mother, the Queen of the Night, the villain of the story, is instructing her to go and seek revenge. She gives her a dagger and says, basically, go and kill Zarastro, or you will no longer be my daughter. And so there's one thing I do want to mention. Again, we recognize the melody. We certainly can appreciate the virtuosity required of the performer to sing this. But I think that Mozart was very intentional in the way that he wrote this particular aria. It's evident that the Queen of the Night is the villain of this story. through a number of occurrences throughout the opera, and then certainly culminating in this moment where she's instructing her daughter to go and seek revenge. And if you notice, the extreme upper register that is employed by this coloratura soprano almost feels mechanical in a sense. It almost sounds like it should have been performed by a flute or an inanimate instrument, just because it's so high and it's so quick, and the vocalises are so fast, and it requires just an exceptional level of agility. I think Mozart, and again, I don't know this for sure, it's just kind of my assumption here. It makes me wonder if Mozart was intentional on this to further separate the Queen of the Night from any kind of human connection the audience might have with her, if it was to maybe push her even further away into that role of villain there. So again, just an interesting thing to think on with that well-known aria. And then the last example here, the Papageno Papagena aria. It's a fun little duet. Papageno is the bird catcher in the story. He kind of represents the common person, the everyday person. His only goal, his only dream in life is to settle down and get married and have a family. And so this duet is where he's realizing that's going to happen. He has found his Papagena, his partner. All right, so that gives us just a little snapshot into what was happening in the various types of opera in the classical period. And as music continues to develop and moves on into the Romantic period, opera experiences a number of changes that are in line with just Romantic period musical characteristics there. But again, that's a conversation for another day. You could do a full lecture on any of the changes that are brought about from Romantic opera. So that's pretty much what I have for you all today. So thank you all for being with me.
Wow, this is amazing. I'm very impressed. Yes, we have several questions Is it okay to ask you some questions as well?
Sure.
Elise? Is it? Yeah, great. I'll have my buddy Aaron, who does a lot of presentations with me, to read some questions, or particularly some questions on texts. One of the questions I have, so most of the operas, and maybe I digress, I'm by no means an expert, are sang in Italian. Then when it switches to German, moves to Germany, it's very dark themes, like a baby dies somewhere. There's this really crazy, like Baba Yaga comes out of nowhere and steals the baby. While we're talking about Italian, the marriage of Figaro, it's completely different paradigm. What
Yeah.
what does that attribute this darkness of Germany versus Italian glamour and ha ha he type of
Yes.
thing? Go ahead.
Um, a good bit of that is probably just simply due to the time period. In the Romantic period, when we really start to see a distinctly German style of opera develop, um, emotional expression becomes primary in music. In the classical period, we have absolute music, which is music for the pure enjoyment of music. And then in the Romantic era, we see this emotion that is really the forefront of composition. And we start to see an exploration into a lot of different themes, even within the human psyche, sometimes some of those darker themes. And so we do see some of those darker sides of the human psyche come through. We see references to the occult, all of those different things. And Carl Maria von Weber's Der Freischütz, certainly the kind of the iconic German style opera has all of those darker elements there. It's essentially a story of good versus evil. Samuel represents the devil. We have a hunter who's wanting to sell his soul to the devil so that he can win this competition. And so, I mean, there's certainly some darker themes and things there. So I think a lot of that's due to the time period.
Excellent, excellent. Yeah, because yeah, I mean, it's to me, it's amazing. Aaron, would you be able to maybe read some questions, maybe some of your own, and then we'll open up to the public as well. Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I'd like to build. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear you well. Thank you.
I'd like to build a little on some of the backgrounder that you were doing, whether it was Louis the 14th or the shape of politics in Germany, et cetera. Is that the influence of the dominant political environment had on opera, and in some ways how opera became a vehicle to communicate to at least elites and other aristocratic or the small amount of middle classes that there were there that were literate and could understand. What's your perspective on how those two sort of tied together, right? Like these either dominant political powerhouses like Louis the 14th, or in the cases that you were bringing up with the German opera, because obviously there was no Germany yet. So these were all Prussian duchies and states, and spoke different dialects of German and Dutch, and so they all had different religious beliefs, and so there was all these sort of layers that were much larger than just the sort of joy of the music. So maybe you have a perspective on that.
Sure, yeah, I certainly see the connection between political situations and what's being produced, either to promote certain political expressions or in response to them. For example, Handel, when he was in England, was writing operas, that were detailing expansion, right? Colonial expansion with the East India Trade Company. He, in a number of his operas, would use musical signifiers that his English audience would have recognized as English, such as the kettle drums or timpani that he used would have been well known. I think they were housed in a cathedral there as well, or were used at a coronation. So certainly composers were able to express either from their own choosing or because of maybe political pressures and things like that. But certainly the arts, and opera is no different, is an expression of what's happening in society around them, political and otherwise.
I have one other follow-up question, and it's and I know we have a lot of people who, you know, this was their first sort of introduction or part of their of their entry into understanding more about opera. Um, how have you sort of either other people you know or even speaking for yourself, sort of developed your ear and your sort of way that you do appreciation of the opera? Because I do find I kind of came to opera later. I wasn't, you know, I was in my maybe, yeah, early 40s, I want to say, that I sort of just clicked finally for me. And I've the last decade sort of really enjoyed it. And I kind of gone down the rabbit hole with it. Whereas earlier, I just didn't, you know, I appreciated it. It was art, you know, it was great, you know, like the usual check boxes when someone says something's great, but it doesn't click with you. And then it finally did click with me. So I'm wondering what's your perspective on that, especially for people who, you know, want to start to enjoy it more and want to understand it more.
Yeah, I would say first and foremost, go see it live if you have the opportunity at all, even if it's a small opera company. Any live performance that you can see is just it's a different experience. I know we had mentioned the AMC option to see it in the theater. Go do those things when you can see it in community and experience it as if you were there. I think we just get a deeper appreciation for the stories, for the technique that goes into it. And I think it's important to remember too, this was entertainment. In the time that this was emerging, this was the equivalent of us going to the movies, right? This is what people would do as a primary form of entertainment. And I think when we think back to the role that that played in culture and society there, maybe it softens us a little bit. It makes it a little more attainable. Sometimes I think we can put some of these artistic expressions on a pedestal, but I think this kind of humanizes it a little bit more for us.
Great. We do have a question from Lloyd. If you're still there, Lloyd, I'm gonna unmute you here. Um, Let me know when you can. Can you hear us, Lloyd?
Oh, yeah. Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Alyssa, just want to thank you so much. That was wonderful introduction there. I had a discussion with somebody. The length of these operas, 3 hours plus, I was sort of pushing back on the idea that at the time they were performed, 19th century, thereabouts, people had a longer attention span, or people could somehow appreciate them more. I pushed back on that, thinking that even for that time period, it might have been taxing for many people's patience. Do you get that sense that, you know, people's eyes were wandering or checking the time, or, you know what I'm saying? I don't think it's so clear cut, like then they loved it, now it's too much. I'm wondering if people struggled with the length at that time.
Yeah. I think that's a great question. I don't know for sure, but I do know it was common. And so it may have just been part of the culture. That's what was expected at some of these performances. I know some of Handel's oratorios were 3 hours. You know, it wasn't. And when you think of it in terms, you know, the symphonies of the classical period were only 30 minutes. Right. And then you have these operas that were so long. And then in the Romantic period, when we get to Wagner and his music dramas, particularly the Ring Cycle, which, I mean, it's like 15 hours of music intended to be performed over, I think, 4 consecutive evenings. It's a monstrous amount of music. And it's hard to imagine today and all the distractions that we have. You know, we have the internet in our watches, on our phones, all of these different things. It's hard to imagine sitting down and being so engaged and so focused on something for that amount of time. But to answer your question, my assumption is that it was just the norm, and that's what people were used to and expected. But I don't know for sure. That's an interesting question.
One other quick sort of follow up to that is, and I'm sure I'm going to butcher this, but I don't speak French, but in French, I think it's called in like entr'acte. It's like the intermediate or the in between the acts. Whoever speaks French here can correct me. So, you know, I do think there was a development in the, so I guess 17th, 18th century, to this recognition that there was, maybe not what we would today call a hard intermission, because I know they would do different things, like because they had to change, right, all the staging and costumes and all those things. So they had this period between them. So, I do think there was, or I'm sorry, what that was called then, to what the play within the play,
Mhm.
right? So that you would get like accidental guests that would be part of it. And then what would they have, the Divermento,
Mhm.
right? And so I mean, there was, I'm sure it wasn't like you're taking an SAT test for 4 hours and that's it,
Right.
endure. That there was some flex in there at various times. And I'm sure there was feedback, obviously.
Mhm. Yeah, that's a good point.
So one question I have, Lisa, so all this combinations and the orchestra and music, now Mozart, lived what, 17th century, basically came to us as original. How much of a variation or additions do people add to it? Or I guess my question, how do we know it's an original that was created? And then would there be, like, we have James, James Bible and all that stuff. People add their stuff and add the pages, translate things. How would you say, I guess, original the
Like the
opera?
providence, like, right, Zach, like you're trying to ask, like how do we judge providence in something as creative as an opera?
Right.
Outside of the music, obviously.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I don't know if this is answering your question or not, but they had music publishers and would catalog music. So all of Mozart's music is kind of grouped together and had editors and things like that. And so I think you could probably find some differences depending on which editor you're getting something from. But I think largely it's going to be fairly consistent um, because we had people preserving music at that time. Certainly not in as strong of a way as we would have now. But I think probably where the difference would lie would be in performance interpretation. So maybe your director of the opera wants to do the magic flute, but maybe they have it set in Los Angeles and it's a very modern kind of updated set, but the storyline's the same. So I think there's certainly room for creativity in modern performances while still staying true to the notes and the crux of the story as well.
All right, let's just see if there's any questions on the chat.
Yeah,
I saw.
quick follow-up on that is that I don't know if you had a chance to see the latest Don Giovanni,
Mhm.
or if you saw it in the theater, but that modern, that I don't want to call it postmodern, but it definitely had a more modern
Yeah.
approach. And I guess I've noticed how visual and costuming, as I've kind of gone deeper, how important that is, because you get used to, I think, if you watch just a lot of Italian opera, it's sort of like the setup is always there and you're just comfortable with it. And then you see maybe more modern opera and they'll have renditions. I've seen this in London, on TV or in theaters, where they will present a complete old opera, but use obviously modern, costuming and accoutrements. And I do think that's a pretty interesting dichotomy. It'd be great to hear your perspective on that.
Yeah, I think it can really go either way. You can be a purist and want it exactly how Mozart would have approved of it, but music has changed since then. Society has changed since then. Art has changed since then, and I think it's the most important thing is that it's still performed, that we're still doing these live offerings of operatic art, and I think the experience would be different depending on the setting of it. If it's terribly modern and you're just thinking, my goodness, this is so outside the realm of what I thought was possible with the magic flute, it might take you back a second. But I do think, the main thing is that it's out there, that it's performed, and that people are enjoying it.
So one of the questions I have in the chat before we get to Lloyd, Beverly says, I'm used to following on with text from hearing operas in different languages. So by habit, I follow the text in English. I noticed that there are more words in English. My question is, where does this extra words come from? Is it directed or personal performing?
So that's a really interesting question. So yeah, the super titles or subtitles there, as we're following along, a lot of it's just difference in language. Some languages will have 3 or 4 words for a single word in English, and sometimes it's the reverse of that. But that's an interesting question. I've never thought of that before.
Yeah, I mean, particularly my future mother-in-law was in Argentina listening to opera. I forget it was the Tosca. And so she was listening to it. And after like 30, 40 minutes, and she's usually very attentive, 30, 40 minutes, she's like, I can't read this anymore. And my fiance speaks Spanish, so she would read the Spanish subtitles. But, it's hard to follow. But once you understand the music, once you follow, once you come to a particular, say you see Anna Netrebko, or Luciano Pavarotti, whatever, you come to the tenors, you come to the singing, you come to the storyline. And a lot of the storytelling to what you were saying it's from that time. We have to kind of understand and live in a lot of history. So our channel is a history channel. That's why, like, for example, you're talking about Dido, right? I mean, how many people know who Dido, right? Carthage, people can't even connect it. It actually relates to Phoenicians, right? The Phoenicians were the original, seafarers that went as far as England. And Dido was one of the colonies that were set up in Africa, Carthage, and she was at the beginning of this whole thing. And we know Carthage from the wars that they committed versus Rome, 3 Punic Wars. The Punic stands for Carthage. So it's interesting, you understand the story, you understand the history, and you listen to opera, it all kind of makes sense. Obviously, some of this stuff is embellished, made up, or whatever, but at the same time, it's interesting. I mean, they connect Dido to Trojans. I mean, there's no historical connection to that whatsoever, whether Troy was in Anatolia and Dido lived in Africa, it's just so it's an interesting, but that's what makes it interesting to me.
Sure.
In that regard. So we have Lloyd with a question. Let me unmute. And how are we doing with time? Alyssa, let us know if if with I apologize because it's so interesting. I would never want to let you go, but you need to let us know.
That's okay. We'll do about 5 more minutes.
5 more minutes, good. All right, thank you so much. Let me unmute Lloyd. 5 more minutes. There you go.
Just a quick question about Don Giovanni for Mozart. Was he sort of having fun with that character? Because I know he himself had numerous mistresses, was a ladies' man, so to speak. So was he is it sort of ironic that he's sort of damning Don Giovanni to hell, and he's sort of, having his mistresses in different cities, I suppose?
Yeah, that's a really interesting connection there. That would be worth kind of looking into to see what some other maybe musicologists have read into just what Mozart was doing in that time period, particularly as he was preparing this opera. But yeah, I think that's an interesting connection. So it very well could have been he was expressing some kind of personal thoughts there through that character.
I think that's all the questions we have, and really appreciate. This is an amazing presentation. I hope you say you have a big audience. Once I said that who's presenting, people looked at your first presentation. So would love to have you back. This is really amazing, and we want to make it kind of relationship here as well. But if you had chance, obviously, I know, and congratulations again on your addition to the family.
Thank you.
And we'll be in contact. Thank you so much again. This was amazing.
Thank
You
you
know.
so much for having me out. It's been a blast.
Thank you. And I hope
Thank you
everybody
so
has a
much.
nice,
Wonderful. This is really wonderful. Thank you.
thank you. All right.
Thank you,
Have a
Zach,
nice-
for all the great work you do and bringing all this great conversation to everybody.
Thank you. Have a nice the rest of the Sunday, guys. Thank you. Bye.
Enjoy.